Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this week's edition of Rochester's Rich History. I am Brandon Fess with the Local History and Genealogy Division at Rochester Public Library. Today we are very happy to welcome Dr. Timothy Neeland from Nazareth College to speak on his recent book, Playing Politics with Natural Disaster, which is about Hurricane Agnes, the 1972 election, excuse me, and the origins of FEMA. Fascinating book. Dr. Neeland is a professor of history and political science and interim director of research, scholarship, and innovation at Nazareth College in Rochester, New York. He is the author of Playing Politics with Natural Disaster, 2020, Democrats and Republicans on Social Issues, 2017, The Buffalo Blizzard of 1977, 2017, Push Button Psychiatry, A Cultural History of Electroshock in America, 2008, and the forthcoming Declaring Disaster, excuse me, Buffalo's Blizzard of 77, and the creation of FEMA, which should be out in early December. He has authored numerous chapter-length studies and encyclopedia articles on American history, politics, and natural disasters. In addition to teaching and writing, Neeland provides political analysis for local, state, national, and international media. Without further ado, Dr. Timothy Neeland.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you all for spending some of your Saturday with us today. I'm sure there's other things you could be doing, but nothing more important right now than talking about natural disasters, particularly in the context in which we're in, right? We're in a situation where we're in a natural disaster. And a lot of people wonder is it just Trump? Is this unique? Would it be much better under a different administration? Maybe today's discussion about something that happened in 1972 can help demystify some of the things that we're going through now. And certainly, you may have questions about what's parallel and questions. So feel free during the Q&A at the end to ask me about anything. I teach on natural disasters and pandemics at Nazareth College, part of the policy area that I study and work on, as the title of the books will indicate, but I also do presidential politics. So today we're going to talk about this book, and it would be impossible to talk about the entirety of a book. So I'm going to give you the outline structure of what happens, introduce you to some fascinating characters that, if you get the book and read it more carefully, you'll read all sorts of fun stories and insights and some of the quirky personalities. This is a book about 1972, but again, I think that what we learned today will make you appreciate more some of the situation we're in now, but also prepare you in terms of thinking about such questions as safety for natural disasters in the future. One of the things I'm mostly troubled by is how unprepared we individual Americans or towns or cities are for events that are actually naturally occurring, hence the term natural disaster. We call them natural hazards, and they only become disasters when human populations are afflicted or affected by them. So we'll talk about that. What I'm going to do is I'm talking. You don't want to look at me the entire time, so I'll probably eliminate my camera and we'll focus on the slides that you should be seeing on your screen. If you have questions about anything I'm saying, if you want me to repeat something, feel free to use the chat feature. Brandon will be monitoring that. So this is a talk, not a lecture. So it's not as if I'm not able to stop and answer or respond to something you want to talk about, and then go back to sort of the main outlines. Really, it's just somewhere between a formal lecture and just sitting around with a cup of coffee and talking about the book. First, I want to give you context, because context is really important in terms of any event. I mean, natural disasters don't happen in a vacuum, right? So if we look at 1972, and again, there are some interesting parallels to our own time. Richard Nixon, the 1972 election, Nixon was obsessed with getting reelected. He was a controversial president, and he was governing at a time when the country was being torn apart by protests. And they were anti-war protests, but there were other kind of protests going on as well. It was a time when Nixon faced a very hostile press, right? The press did not like Richard Nixon. And if you've ever, if you understand that time period, if you've read up on it, or even seen some movies. I mean, when is the last time you saw a movie about Richard Nixon that made him anything but a villain, right? There is a kind of a cultural sense of Richard Nixon that comes out of that time period of the early 1970s. Certainly by the 1970s, the government overpromised and underdelivered. And that's really the other thing. And I mean by that, political scientists of the time period were very struck by how the New Deal and the Great Society had promised Americans a very different kind of lifestyle, and that the government would be there to intervene when there were problems, social, economic. But it never really was capable of resolving all of the problems, and it left people very upset. So as we think about that, let me just, I've got some chats up. All right. And then federal disaster policy was a fairly new concept at that point in time. So let's think about Richard Nixon. He's president during the crisis we're going to talk about. You have to understand, he only won 43% of the popular vote in '68. Right? He did better in the Electoral College, but there were 3 candidates in '68, including the avowed racist George Wallace and the American Independence Party, that took actual electoral votes. So that clearly made Nixon a more fragile leader, right? He'd won a plurality of votes, but he faced a Congress that was in the hands of the Democrats. And if you understand American politics, the Democrats virtually ran Congress from 1933 to 1994. One of the reasons we seem to be more partisan in the last 25 years or so is because there's now competition for control of Congress that we really didn't have for much of the mid part of the 20th century. We certainly saw Nixon then with a job approval rating that tended to be about 55% in his first term. Now, that sounds great, but I mean, if Donald Trump had those numbers, he'd be, singing a song and doing a dance, although I can't imagine that. So as we think about that, right, we think about 55% seems high, but in the context of the late 60s and early 70s, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson had approval ratings 70% or higher in their first term. So Nixon, in comparison, had less favorability. If we think about the protests of the time, right, the country was being torn apart. The Democratic Party was being remade from the old left to the new left. Just like now, when we think about how progressive liberal Democrats, we think of AOC and the so-called squad versus the more established progressives like Nancy Pelosi, right? And some of the conflict there. Well, that was going on at this point in time too, as protests, as new leaders were emerging, and as there was a great deal of debate in this country about who we are. Pro-war, anti-war demonstrations, environmental demonstrations. Nixon, of course, was articulated a law and order platform in the 1960s and going into 1972. So very controversial president, a country that was at odds with each other over its identity. And then also, it's not surprising then that the Democrats picked an anti-war, very liberal progressive by the name of George McGovern, who from his acceptance speech of the DNC, which you can see on this slide, he was channeling the Kennedys, right? Both Bobby, who was assassinated in '68 on his run for the White House, and of course John F. Kennedy, who died in November of '63, also by assassination. So it was a time period in which there was a huge contrast between the candidates, between McGovern and Nixon. Nixon did not do well with the press. I have to say they hated him. They hated him from day one. They saw him as Tricky Dicky, a nickname that he earned. They saw him as a negative influence in American politics. They saw him as someone who was devious, manipulative, secretive, and frankly, Nixon never helped himself because, in fact, he was all of those things. Turns out they were right. Well, that doesn't help your reputation. And so Nixon was facing a press, again, contextually, very different from the press. My goodness, FDR had the press eating out of the palm of his hand. We literally call the press lapdogs of FDR. They hid from the public his illnesses. They hid from the public his philandering. They hid from the public anything FDR wanted them to. And that followed along right up through Johnson. Johnson may have been the first one to really face, Lyndon Johnson may have been the first to really face a press that was somewhat in opposition, but Nixon bore the brunt of it. Larry Sabato calls it the feeding frenzy. The press went from lapdog to maybe watchdog, and it's going to get worse for presidents as time goes on. So Nixon was faced with that. Now, as you know, our current occupant of the White House likes to tweet out to circumvent the press. Nixon had his own strategy. He made radio addresses or wrote press releases that were sent out to the small town and suburban newspapers that used to be in more proliferation in this country to circumvent the Washington press corps that was very hostile to Richard Nixon. Here's the thing about the press. They don't like it when you lie to them. So if you're ever going to run for office, dear God, don't lie to the press because they will not forget. So, and then of course the economy was, teetering as inflation was rising because of the Vietnam War. And at the same time, his public confidence in the government was falling. And that as you can see from the charts, will continue a precipitous decline over time. You know, we have a very different culture by the 1970s than we had from the time of Franklin Roosevelt up to Nixon. And then afterwards, we live in a very different world than many of the mid-20th century Americans did. But it's not uncommon. If you look at partisanship, going back in the 19th century, it was much more common. So nothing that we haven't experienced before. Well, let's add to that something called deindustrialization, which the flood is going to have an impact on. And I go into this actually in the book, because to me, this is one of the hidden stories about disasters. Not going to get into it today. I'm not going to fill your head with things like, the shock doctrine by Naomi Klein, and I'm not going to talk about things like disaster capitalism. But if those are intriguing to you, please do pick up the book and you'll get a chance to drill down into that. But if you were in this area, if you understand the Southern Tier, they had a robust economy of manufacturing right through the 1960s. American France was the largest manufacturer of fire engines in the US and maybe the world at one time. And then of course, Remington Rand, which made typewriters, which were a big thing before computers, may have also been the largest, if certainly one of the largest manufacturing of typewriters in the country. And it was in Elmira. And these are going to be negatively affected by the flood. The flood's going to come in and wipe out their facilities. They're not going to rebuild, right? They're done. And that's going to render Elmira much more impoverished after the flood of 1972 than it was before. So Hurricane Agnes is going to not cause it, but it's going to accelerate changes in society. Well, let's talk about the disaster, shall we? Let's talk about the hurricane. As you know, we've had a hurricane season recently, unlike no other, except of course it is like others. When you deal as a historian and you read the press accounts of things and you understand the context of things, sometimes the press tends to breathlessly approach things as if it's never happened before. Because of course, to sell newspapers, you want to be the most extreme or the first or the most controversial. But yes, it's been a very active hurricane season. In 1972, the first hurricane of the season, Agnes, beginning with the letter A, is going to strike the United States in June. It's going to actually strike Florida on June 19th. What's interesting about this satellite photo is, of course, satellites were new in 1972, right? We had just begun launching satellites for things like weather forecasting in the late 1960s. We only began naming hurricanes after the Second World War, and up until Jimmy Carter's administration, they were all named for females. But of course, feminists objected to that. And Jimmy Carter then used some executive power to make sure that storms would then be named, right, male and then female alternately. And we talk about category 1. Well, the Sapier-Simpson scale that we scale hurricanes on only was invented in 1971. So it's a time of new. And a category 1 is winds, somewhere in excess of like 75 miles an hour, and it's a slower moving storm than some of the superstorms that we often talking about when we talk about like category 3 and category 4 and category 5. But seriously, these are also quite damaging because although slow moving, like for example, Hurricane Agnes created a storm surge of 20 feet as it came from the Gulf of Mexico past the Florida Panhandle up through Georgia and some other places, and of course spawned dozens of tornadoes with horrific effect. In fact, directly the storm would be responsible for the death of 128 people and would leave tens of thousands of people homeless from Florida up through New York. It caused well over $3.1 billion damage and left historic flooding records in places like Richmond, Virginia, Ellicott City, Maryland, and Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and Corning and Elmira, New York. These are places that were quite damaged by the storm. And so the storm track, which you can see here, comes out of the Gulf of Mexico, over the Florida Panhandle, through Georgia and the Carolinas. Then it goes out to sea. And at that point in time, it's diminished and weakened to tropical storm status. Typically, then a storm dissipates and is not heard from. Agnes did something interesting. It took a turn back landward, ended up stalling over the mid-Atlantic, where it was joined by another weather system out of Ohio. And together, those two systems are going to dump trillions of gallons of water. One expert suggested that it was like dumping a quarter of Lake Erie out on the mid-Atlantic region. Well, Lake Erie holds 127 trillion gallons of water. So it's a tremendous amount of water. And it fell in areas that were already saturated from previous rains. It had been a very wet and cool spring. The winter had left a lot of snow melt. So there wasn't a lot of places to put the water by the time it fell. And it's going to fall into an area along the so-called Susquehanna River Basin, which is the largest in the Northeast. And it, one branch begins in Cooperstown and it ends in the Chesapeake Bay region at Havre de Grace. And but there's two stems of the Susquehanna. So such things as the Cohocton and the Chemung River are part of that. And so places that are going to be flooded appear on your map here: Corning, Elmira, to a lesser extent, Binghamton, Pittston, and Wilkes-Barre, and then of course Harrisburg all along. But what really is interesting about this is it wasn't just the Susquehanna. If you lived in this area, for example, up by Edgemere, along Greece and places like that, those were flooding. There was flooding in Rochester. There was flooding in the Allegheny River system. Olean was inundated, and there were great fears the Almond Dam would collapse. And there was flooding along the Hudson River, and Ardsdale on the Hudson and other places were experiencing pretty deep flooding. And then of course the Genesee was also threatening to flood as well. So if you were here in 1972, you would remember this. I vaguely, I have a recollection. I'm old enough to remember, I was 9 in 1972. And I remember when this storm system sort of was sweeping through at one point with such strong winds, my front door blew open and it had been locked. So there was some interesting weather related phenomena to that. As the flooding begins to occur, the dams around the area were strained. And dams are quite wonderful systems built to retain water. So why do you build a dam? Well, you could do it for hydroelectric power, but many dams are containment dams. And what you do is you know that there's a flooding risk in an area. You know there's an area that you want to somehow contain and then slowly release water so that it doesn't flood all at once. And dams all along the area, I referenced the Almond Dam, but Mount Morris Dam, which protects Rochester from flooding, nearly was overtopped. It came within 3 feet of the top of the dam. And at which point, of course, what do? You have to release that water. And so you create flooding in some designated areas, and the water was released, so it was pretty much devastating local farmland, but did not necessarily hit the city of Rochester. So probably saved the city of Rochester from the kind of flooding which was typical to Rochester until this dam was built in the 1950s. Prior to the 1950s, Rochester flooded on a fairly regular basis because of the Genesee River. But it wasn't just here. I mean, there were the governor of Maryland, and I was able to talk to him when I was writing this book, was freaked out because he thought that the Conowingo Dam down near the Chesapeake Bay was going to fail, and that there would be water would rush into Baltimore. There was fears that Harrisburg, the dam above Harrisburg, would fail. So there are a number of threats going on that were creating terrible circumstances for the individuals. The dams were holding, but also people were concerned a little bit about, for example, whether or not their dikes would hold. A dike is another barrier system that we create when we know there's going to be likely flooding in an area. And a dike is just a containment wall, and it's built along a river, and it protects a city. And you estimate, the Army Corps of Engineers will go, well, let's see, what's the greatest flood we're going to have in a 100-year time period? Then they use that to calculate how high the dike should be. And then that leads them to build a dike. Now, the Army Corps of Engineers didn't do this kind of work really until the 20th century. Again, relatively new. I mean, the dikes surrounding places like Corning and Elmira, those are built in the 1940s. Right? Those are still fairly new, and they are built by the Army Corps, but it's local governments that have to maintain them. Now, most people, thought they were miraculous. Dams containing water, fairly new in the 20th century for places like Rochester, and then dikes in places like Elmira and Corning and Wilkes-Barre, pretty much built up by the Army Corps of Engineers in the 20th century. Here's the problem with all of this, and this is one of the things I talk about in the book. You are lulling people into a false sense of security. You're living in Rochester and you're like, oh, there's nice property along the Genesee River. You may have noticed in the city of Rochester, they just built some really nice housing near the public library. And guess what, folks? That dam that we built in Mount Morris is not going to protect them at some point. If you ever saw Jurassic Park or you read the book, nature is going to out. We are merely delaying a sort of inevitability because we can never build a completely foolproof dam. Ask the Chinese. They've been doing this since, prehistory, right? The bend in the Yellow River, right? The Yangtze River. They have been battling their riverine systems since, in fact, some scholars say that's how you become a civilization, like hydraulic civilizations. You battle the water course. But, people in Corning and Elmira felt completely safe. And one of the things I talk about in the book is how people in the 21st century, you buy a house, you don't know that it was once flooded. You buy a house and you think, well, it's never flooded here. It can't flood here. Flooding is a natural phenomena, and it's caused by a number of factors, climate change being one of them, but also, look, you put up more concrete, you put up more asphalt, and you knock down more trees, you have just created new systems of drainage, and that water's got to go somewhere. It might be headed for your house. Just saying, that's one of the things we talk about in the book. The book is not just a historic, because I do politics as well. I'm very concerned that I make people more aware of the kind of danger you may be facing. All right, so the dikes and the dams, so people in Corning felt safe, but of course the next morning around 4:30 a.m., the dikes were overtopped, they eroded the basin, they failed, and Corning flooded up to 20 feet. I have to say there, one of the things why I wrote this book is my grandmother lived in Painted Post, and her house was flooded and she was rescued from an attic, and that story was told from the time I was a kid. And when I came to Nazareth College in 2000 and I was looking for a new research project, I thought, well, I wonder if there's anything in a flood. And of course, I discovered a rich mine of information about the 72 flood, and of course led to the book. And if you'll notice the big building there, the building in the foreground there, the Corning glass, people were on top of that and had to be rescued by helicopter because people were not evacuated from Corning, and 19 people will die. One of them was a baby, actually swept out of his mother's hands. You see, when a dike or a levee fails, the water rushes out at like 35 miles an hour, and it knocks people over, and it's a force to be reckoned with. Meanwhile, in Wilkes-Barre, again, convinced that their dikes could not fail them, the local civil defense operation ordered sandbagging, and the sandbagging was meant to protect the citizens, and it failed, and probably delayed people from evacuating as they thought they could fight the river. And the man behind that was Frank Townend, who was someone who didn't talk to anybody else. He never called up. Corning floods around 4:30, 5 a.m. in the morning on Friday, and Wilkes-Barre will flood around 11. They had hours to prepare, but they weren't talking to each other. This is Wilkes-Barre after the flood. And of course, compounding the tragedy was the fact that fires broke out due to gas leaks or gas or accelerants. And the fire department couldn't do anything to put them out. They had to let buildings burn down to the water line. So great tragedy. The one difference was our friend Joe Sartori Jr. Down in Elmira. He was the brand new city manager there. And when the rain was falling, he said, "Show me the flood maps from the 1940s. And he said, "Well, I think it may flood." Everyone said, "You're crying wolf. You're going to get kicked out of your job. People don't like to leave their homes in the middle of the night." And Joe Sartori ordered evacuation in Elmira. No one lost their lives, even though Elmira was flooded, as you can see here, and was devastated. Like everyone else, the water went up about 15 feet in these cities, which is up through the second floor of the buildings. Now, federal disaster policy at that time was new. Notice how I keep saying the word new? It's because when you've been, here we are 50 years on, we expect the federal government to have a stronger role. It did not in 1972. It was only been 20 years since the federal government even had a hand, and it was very clear from congressional legislation, but also something called the US Constitution, that disasters and pandemics are really within the purview of local and state governments, and the federal government can only come in to supplement when asked to assist. Now, when you are asked to assist, you should be willing to assist. But our disaster agencies then, as of now, are often multitasking, and they do not have the personnel to deal with disasters. They don't keep a crew on hand. So what they do is they have to hire, and they have to train, and they have to send people into these areas. And some of the training is good, and some of the training is abysmal. And also, whenever disaster aid is unleashed, you're talking dozens of different government agencies, many of whom don't like each other and don't talk to each other. So the states were both led by interesting men. I talk about them a great deal in the book. Let's just say they were studying contrasts. Nelson Rockefeller did virtually nothing for the state of New York. I mean, I guess the Southern Tier wasn't something he was worried about. He was a Republican, and the Southern Tier is notably a very Republican area. So perhaps he wasn't worried about the electoral consequences. But I have to say, his mind was on other things. He was ambitious and wanted to be president. And some of you may know that he resigned as governor, not because of scandal, but because he was bored. And so he leaves office in 73 under his own power. He will become vice president under Gerald Ford in 1974. No one could have predicted that in 72, but pretty much his political career is going to end after that. And the man on the right is Milton Schaap. Milton was a phenomenally funny character, which I talk about in the book. But let's just say he was a goad in the side of Richard Nixon, constantly demanding more federal intervention. And he even changed the Pennsylvania Constitution so he could give direct payments to flood victims. Very different. So left on their own, local governments have a lot to do. And one of the things that fascinates me about the current pandemic is like Michael Mendoza and Adam Bello, and how the local leadership is really taking ownership for a lot of things going on, which is both constitutional and frankly practical and pragmatic. In Corning, without a great deal of federal support or even state support, the Houghton family play a key role. And I am happy to say I was able to talk to Amo Houghton before he died. He died this year. Lovely man, very gracious. And then more importantly, he sent me off to talk to his chief of staff, so to speak, who gave me a great deal more detail. But the family grouping here on the far left is Ambassador Houghton, Amory Houghton Sr. Amo Houghton Jr. is the one facing the camera. And then you've got Jamie Houghton on the right. And so Houghton family played a key role. They decided to stay in Corning, that Corning Incorporated would rebuild after the flood. They would reinvest. Amo Houghton directly created a foundation that created such things as the Rockwell Museum of Art, helped save Watkins Glen Speedway, and did some other key investments for the community. And I would say that if you go to Corning now, that city was pretty much saved by the Houghton family. Another key character I talk about in the book that I think is fascinating from a local politics point of view is Cadillac Bill Smith, someone you've probably never heard of, but who was infamous because he got farm supports in the Kennedy administration, from the Kennedy administration, used it to buy a Cadillac, drove it to Washington as a protest against big government spending. Bill was one of these hyper-conservative people, but turned out to have a heart of gold and did everything he could. He held hearings about the flood and why we weren't warned about it. He wanted to know what the government could do better, and he wanted to reform natural disaster policy in New York State. Sadly, none of his ideas bore fruit because, again, New York State was reluctant to participate. We can talk about that in Q&A, why governors prefer to cry poor and say they can't do anything, because the federal government only helps you out if you can't do it yourself. So you have to somehow prove you're completely incapable of dealing with a disaster, and then you can get federal money. And most governors prefer to do that rather than spend money in the state that then has to be replenished by perhaps raising taxes in the state, and then they become the bad person. In Wilkes-Barre, there's a couple of interesting people I talk about in the book. One is Judge Max Rosen, and he mentored people like Stephen Breyer, who's on the Supreme Court now, and also a woman named Min Matheson, who was a former labor leader. Both of them are going to be pretty active in shaping how government money is spent and attempting to raise the profile of Wilkes-Barre so it can get the kind of federal funding it needed. There's at least $1 billion of damage in Wilkes-Barre alone because of that flood. Another interesting character you meet in the book is Daniel J. Flood. He wore white suits and had like a snidely whiplash mustache. He will be a vocal proponent for assisting the flood victims and will help shape the subsequent legislation. I have to say, he is a fun character to read about. And his life, he ended tragically. The FBI got him claiming that he took bribes during the flood and afterwards, although we never found the money. And most of the allegations came from someone he had recently hired. I don't know if he was a victim of, an overzealous prosecutory system or not. They never convicted him, but he did finally come up with a plea deal to end investigations into him that lasted into the 1980s. And part of that deal meant he left office, and he died, although he's still a hero. If you live in Wilkes-Barre, people love him down there. They don't think he's guilty or dirty at all. But then there's Richard Nixon, who Nixon used this, and I'm not going to say much more. This is sort of the president and his men, right? Rockefeller, Agnew, Nixon, Romney, George Romney, Mitt Romney's dad, and then Ray Schaefer, the former governor of Pennsylvania. But for Nixon, this was just, he flew by, he's on his way to Camp David on the Saturday after the flood hit. And he goes, oh, look at that. That's really bad. And then what he did at Camp David is he put together his all-star team for the baseball. He was very unconcerned. He had to be goaded into going to Harrisburg for a quick trip, helicopter in, meet some victims, leave. But mostly he left the day-to-day tour to Agnew who then came back and told him everyone was happy and the federal government was working great. And Nixon was like, super, that's all I need to know. Because what I want to do, he said, is I'm going to use this to try to win 1972 re-election. And New York and Pennsylvania had not voted for Nixon in 68. So he decided that he was going to come up with the most generous disaster relief bill in US history to that time. And it was going to be chock full of goodies. And in order to get other congressmen to vote for it, he was going to include disasters that occurred earlier in the year. For example, flooding in South Dakota and a mudslide in West Virginia. And he was going to do all of this. And the generous money was going to come in and people were going to be really thrilled. The problem is, when this happens, the local people end up with loans, not necessarily full grants, to rebuild their homes and businesses, loans that have to be repaid. And the benefits don't accrue to the local area because the money comes from the federal government through banks and subcontractors. Individuals are contractually obligated to borrow that money and then to repay it. But that money goes back out, oftentimes to banks, larger banks, or contract firms that are not necessarily in the area. Because after a flood, guess what's not open? A lot of local banks and a lot of local contractors. And then the locals are left with a bill. And so I find, at least from my study in 1972, the natural disasters did not help, if you will, the local economy per se. And then, you know, Nixon had, I talk about this a little bit, but Nixon's ability to respond when people in Wilkes-Barre in particular were angry at him. He went to Wilkes-Barre, presumably unannounced, but somehow he had a giant $1 million check for the local government. I guess he just had that in his office. But he told the press it was unannounced, and he shows up in Wilkes-Barre on August 9th, 1972, and he walks amongst the people, and I have to say, Richard Nixon in front of a camera looks like he's guilty of something. Richard Nixon one-on-one with people, he was actually charismatic, and you don't see that unless you really study the history. And people responded well. So there he is, and there's Frank Carlucci. Frank Carlucci is going to be critical to reforming disaster policy. How did Richard Nixon succeed in 1972? Well, he won every state except Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. That is, he won in a landslide. His popular vote total went up from 43% to 60%, and he won, as you can tell, nearly every single electoral vote available. The Democrats lost big time. And so Richard Nixon, despite being controversial and hated by the press, apparently was beloved of the American people. Who knew? If you just look at sort of pop history. Although after election, and this is the warning for today, he cut generous benefits. He eliminated his disaster agency, folded it in under the Housing and Urban Development Cabinet Office, and then basically backed out of the federal government being responsible. So the warning and caveat here for those people, you know, expecting, you know, another stimulus check after the election, well, I guess we'll see, right? Because a lot of times the money, you know, being expended is meant, if you will, as a kind of inducement or emolument to voters to come out and vote for you. I'm going to leave it there because we're probably just about time, but that gives you a nice flavor, I think, for the book. There's so much more in there, and you know, there's more of me warning, hectoring, and pestering people to be more, shall we say, aware of how they should think about natural hazards and how they should be prepared. Don't count on the government to help you, please, because it will fail you. It generally does. All right, I'm gonna be quiet now, and I'm gonna turn it over to Brandon, who will facilitate any Q&A.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Nealand. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. Wonderful presentation. We haven't had any questions come up in the chat. Is there anyone who'd like to start the conversation?
Okay, so I see a chat question. Did you see and use the flood of 1972, aftermath of Hurricane Agnes in the Genesee Valley? In fact, I did. When I was writing this book, there were a lot of places I could have talked about. At one time I thought, well, maybe I'll talk about Maryland as well, and I'll talk about Pennsylvania, Maryland, New York, and I'll go in depth. But in order to tell the story in a way that I like to tell stories, which is not to make a 500-page or 700-page book like some of my colleagues, I decided to focus in and also talking to the editor at Cornell. We went back and forth about what to include and what to exclude. So yeah, I didn't get much into that. So I used instead the Susquehanna river system as the key to telling this story, because really the three cities I talk about were the greatest damaged. Ellicott City in Maryland was pretty damaged as well. And all right, so another question I see is, what is your take on how FEMA has since evolved? Well, that's a great question. This is from Linda. Linda, FEMA's done a decent job. And here's the thing. I do credit Richard Nixon in the book for backing away from the sort of, if you will, greater role for the federal government that was part and parcel of, say, Lyndon Johnson's administration. What he did in 1974 is he's going to pass the Disaster Relief Act. And he's going to include in there $200,000 for every state so that they can write their own natural disaster plans. And he's going to create new technical institutes so that emergency managers, which we didn't have that term in 1972, but we've created it, could go to places, for example, there's a natural disaster training center right near the Pennsylvania-Maryland border. And you can go there and study. So what's going to happen is he's going to really begin to help states begin to come up with better plans, better preparation for disasters. And really that is kind of what FEMA is going to pick up on, this idea that we must strengthen local governments and be prepared. My one knock on FEMA that Jimmy Carter is going to put together is that Nixon did do something I liked. He bifurcated, he took out military planning from his new sort of disaster agency that he put in HUD. And I like that because what I've seen with FEMA is it's either focused too much on natural disasters like Clinton and not to the extent of going, oh, there's terrorism, or too much on militarism like Reagan, and not enough on natural disasters. And that tends to diminish the capacity of the agency. The best example in our lifetime is probably Katrina, right? George W. Bush was focused on Homeland Security. FEMA got wrapped up in that, and it was all about, threats and such, not necessarily about natural disasters, which diminishes it. And I would even say for Trump, Trump didn't eliminate the agency that Biden keeps saying he eliminated. He took it and he put it over in a different area to be prepared for such things as biological warfare. And that is the problem, right? Because you're trying to achieve dual use, as they call it, or multi-use. I'm not a big fan of that because I haven't seen it work well. So great question. I think FEMA under Bill Clinton probably worked the best for natural disasters. Fausto has a question. How do you find out what areas are prone to flooding before buying a house? Are there any places that are more favorable? Well, here's the thing. very few states require that kind of disclosure. I mean, certainly if they make you buy flood insurance, you know you're in a flood area. But there are places that have not yet flooded or have not flooded in a while. And this is, for example, down in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, down around Wilkes-Barre. A lot of people bought homes there and thinking they were not in a flood zone. And in fact, they said, they were told, oh, look, don't worry, we built the dikes even higher after 72. Ha. And then we built new dams. There's a series of dams that were built after the 72 flood down in Pennsylvania. If you go down 15 towards Lake Washington, you'll stop and you'll go, oh, look at this great little Pennsylvania rest area. And then I'm going to look out on these new dams. The problem is those dikes in particular tend to just take the water that used to flood a city and they're going to flood somewhere else. So after Hurricane Lee in 2011, a lot of people got wet. I would urge the state to require this kind of disclosure, right? The only other thing to do is obviously to talk to a real estate broker who's going to tell you what they know about an area and talk to neighbors. But yeah, it's not necessarily disclosed. One of the things FEMA's done is in some areas they have these cool signs called the high water mark that tells you where someplace flooded. So like if you're in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, you could be tooling down and you'll see this little sign. I go, what is that? And it says, oh, by the way, in 1972, the flood reached here. And you're like, there's no water around here. That's the point, is that water will go into areas that are not necessarily prone to flooding. And you just don't know when it's going to happen. What areas are more favorable? High, build high, and stay away from any kind of riverine system. The view is beautiful, but okay, this is where I probably shouldn't say this on tape, but my solution for flooding up along you know, the Plan 2014 and controversy along Lake Ontario is either make people build their homes up on stilts or have go through FEMA, purchase the land and turn it back into like public land so that you would deal with that because inevitably flooding is going to happen along Lake Ontario, and it's no matter whether it's Plan 2014 or not, climate change is going to create situations. A range of sources. You know, writers love to talk about this, and so I hope I'm not boring everybody. I'm talking to a writer, Raleigh Adams, who's a terrific writer, and you know, former head of the Strong Museum, among other things. In fact, his newest book is Found in Pieces, so go read it. It's awesome. And South of Little Rock, another great book by Raleigh. But range of sources. Okay, so obviously the first blush of history is going to be newspapers. You want to get a sense from newspapers. Why? Well, because then I can find names. Who was in charge in 1972? And I can make a list. And then, you know, as I started my research, who's still alive? So after I have that, after I have a kind of outline of what the press is saying, and get a list of other things. And I don't just mean newspapers. I mean, there are audio recordings. University of College Park, Maryland has a number of audio recordings. One of the most fascinating, Richard Nixon in Harrisburg with this young African-American girl. She was about 9 and had been separated from her family. This guy is, again, if you see him on Saturday Night Live in a caricature of Dan Aykroyd or something, you think, wow, what a tool. But in real life, this guy actually had a beating heart and, you know, wasn't just, you know, the masked devil. And so he's talking to her in a very tender fashion. Something is not necessarily manufactured. So you get audio recordings as well. There are obviously news tapes as well that you can look at. And I use some of that. Government reports, after action reports by every agency. You can find them available now. A lot of that's on the web, but some of it's through the Hathaway Trust, and some of it is obviously published in government docs, which you can get at certain libraries or government documents. And then interviews. I talked to Joe Sartori Jr. I talked to Bill Smith and his wife Dorothy. Now, Bill was suffering a little bit from dementia at the time, but his memory of 72 was pretty clear. I talked to Amo Houghton. I talked to Governor Mandel from Maryland. I talked to a number of people at the National Weather Service. Obviously, I also had access to some interesting interviews people had conducted, oral histories that were taken after 1972. So even though I couldn't talk to those people, I had their response in an oral history of events. And then going to the Nixon Library, which was at that time was still at the National Archive. Fascinating stuff. I lived in Elmira 10 years after Agnes. What I found striking besides the post-Agnes economic troubles was the defeatist attitude of many people. We could make that improvement, but why bother? Because eventually it will be destroyed somehow anyway. Floods are incredibly destructive and discouraging. This is from Peter. Peter, I agree. I think in particular Elmira, and I read about this in the book, Elmira went for the prison economy, which was a big thing in the late 80s, early 90s, and into 2000. This idea that one could stimulate the economy by bringing in different prison complexes. I should also point out, I talked to the local historians of, you always talk to historians, right? So you go, and the community historians for, Chemung County and Steuben County, I talked to them. They were great sources of all sorts of insights and wisdom, and they know where the bodies are buried. But yeah, I talked to them, and he, at one point he says, yeah, I didn't realize it then. We used to be Elmira was the city of Mark Twain. Now we're a prison city. And that's a very different situation. What Elmira tried to do was to knock down all their cute little shops because they were threatened by the Arno Mall, which was in Big Flats, which is between Elmira and Corning. And they thought, we'll knock these down and we'll build parking garages. Yay, because everyone loves a parking garage. But they lost the character of Elmira. And as a result of that decision-making, which did not include a lot of input from the community, and I point that out in the book, the other thing that happens is these decisions are made by elites. Sometimes they're elites that make good decisions, like Amo Houghton, and turning Corning into this boutique, these cute little shops on Market Street. I mean, before 72, if you know anything about like Ridge Road back when Kodak was a thing, all the strip joints and all the bars out there that you can still see little lingering bits from, it was kind of a hole. But people would work, they'd take their lunchtime, they go have a few brewskis, and then you go back to work and make, dishware and Corning. But they were like, no, we're getting rid of that. And we're going to make it into this great sort of touristy destination. And we're going to, oh, look, the Rockwell Museum of Art. And we're going to, Watkins Glen. Brilliant idea on their part. They saw the future for the Southern Tier in a way that Elmira was looking to the past. They wanted to replicate what they had. And Wilkes-Barre did some of the same thing. They went for, they'd had some economic downturn in Wilkes-Barre caused by the end of the coal mines. And so they were like, oh, well, we did these economic development agencies and we rebuilt this and that. That also failed. I mean, if you've been to Wilkes-Barre, they're sort of in between Corning and Elmira in their economic situation. It's not particularly good situation. There's a lot of empty spaces, and instead of prisons, they went for gambling and Native American, Mohegan tribes built a casino, and that's taking money out of the area, not necessarily keeping it there. So again, these are some of the things that happen after disaster that you never hear about. And so to me, the after story and what happens to people's lives because of disaster, I think it's important because most politicians will promise you, we're going to give you money and it's going to be better than ever. And it's not. So better not to have a disaster or to be prepared for it.
We do have one question that was actually skipped over. That was also asking where he might, that was also from Fausto, asking might find out about flood zones in the Rochester and Brighton area.
Okay, great. So there are zoned flood maps put out by FEMA now that come out of the National Flood Insurance Program. So what you can do is I would contact Joe Morelli's office and ask them to assist you in locating where the flood zones are in these areas to figure out where FEMA has mapped it, because that's one good way to do that. The other thing is I'd call the local history people. Every town in New York has a historian, and they have these files. They call them vertical files, which I also went to all of the history societies and I looked in their vertical files, and I talked to people. That's the fun part of writing, right? The hard part is putting it on paper, but the fun part is gathering the information. But they will also know about the Rochester-Brighton area. So both sort of the federal knowledge base and, official, but then talk to people to find out about where there might be some flooding. And again, you don't always know where flash flooding is going to occur because, again, it's got a lot to do with the way that you have reshaped the landscape. Did you get rid of the wetlands? Did you knock down trees that are natural sponges? Did you get rid of a retaining pond? Did you, right? The water that used to go, X is now going to be redirected in a way, and it will sometimes cause unexpected things. Ellicott City, which thought it was safe after 1972, had a tremendous flood fairly recently, and it was a flash flood. Everyone was just sort of hanging out. And then, we're talking a couple of feet of water suddenly swept through the area. Because what happens, I compare it to like an avalanche of water in the book, how water will accumulate. And as it's accumulate, it actually, like in the rivers, it compresses. Water becomes denser as it begins to build up towards flood stage. And that is also creating great pressure. And when that's released, that's going to have an effect. But even so, just as water begins to find its way. Okay. Somebody asked where I can find the book, where it's available. I hate to redirect you to online shopping because I'm a big fan of local bookstores. The book is probably most easily available, either free through your public library or, Amazon.com, Barnes and Noble. But I bet if you called up your local independent bookseller, which I'm a big fan of, like Liftbridge Books or some such, if they don't have a copy, they could order you a copy and have it come in or have it sent directly to you if you didn't want to go out. So please, I appreciate the ask and the plug. It's great to write a book. It's better for people to read it. I don't see any questions popping up.
Any other questions? Well, folks, if we're not having any other questions come along, if you've enjoyed today's talk, we can always try to get, we do have another question. What's the most challenging and enjoyable part of your research?
The most challenging is when something's happened, like there's an event that's described to you either in an oral history or, you see something about it in the paper and you can't verify it. Now, as a historian, I generally want more than one source for any story I pick. Okay, this is me slamming Bob Woodward. Bob Woodward takes everything people say and then he builds a story based upon what he thinks is the most interesting and salacious. I can't do that. I'm a historian, so I have to have verifiable information. So that can be frustrating because I got some great stories that I could have put in the book that are colorful, but I couldn't verify them. Like, for example, why the head of the Red Cross was thrown out of Joe Nasser's office. Joe Nasser was the Richard Daley of Corning, the most powerful man, the longest serving mayor in New York after, what was his name? The guy like from Albany. So he's a powerful man. And there's a great story there that I have on oral, but I could never verify it. So that was frustrating. But most enjoyable, talking to people and getting their stories. I talked to Charlie Bradley, who I met by hapstance when I was using the Rockefeller archives. Rockefeller archives too, of course, Milton Schaap's papers in Pennsylvania State Archives. Lots of archives, love archives. Richard Nixon papers, Spiro Agnew papers, lots of fun going in archives. Archivists are delightful people and they love to talk to you. The people at the New York State Archives were so supportive. Jim Foltz up there was very encouraging, and you know, it's good to talk to people in the process who are, you know, thrilled by your topic and behind it. So that, I think, was the greatest. Yes, and somebody asked me about FEMA and the pandemic. So the FEMA has played a supportive role in the pandemic because of the nature of the pandemic. Presumably, the task force put together under Mike Pence, which includes the head of the CDC. Generally, the CDC plays a more visible role in things like pandemics. They're slightly different because of the medical angle of it. But I would say that, yes, I would love to write a book on the pandemic, but again, using kind of local frame of reference. I would say the FEMA has been pretty much AWOL during this. They certainly weren't particularly helpful. Donald Trump basically told the people to try to go out and get your own PPE equipment and other things. That's not what the president typically does, and not just to knock in before the election, because I'm not electioneering here. But that was not helpful in a lot of ways. It pitted governors against each other, and certainly would be something I would love to see changed in the future. Then somebody asked about the Red Cross archives. Yes, Red Cross archives, huge archives on Long Island, brilliant place to get information. So again, when I was putting the book together, I thought, do I include the NGOs? Do I talk about things like the Red Cross or the Salvation Army, for example, or the Mennonite Brotherhood? These are all involved in helping out after disaster. But then there's also other places. Like at one point, I talked to a couple of pastors. One was from a church here in Brighton, and another was from a church in some other place, where they actually sent their kids down to go help out, clean out houses and do things like that. So there's lots of stories there. Again, how do you frame a book up? Do you make it everything, or do you focus? And because my focus was on the politics and policy, I left some of that out. But yes, I did see Red Cross archives, and they're fascinating. That's so great. Erastus Corning. Thank you, Larry. Larry gave me the name of Erastus Corning. You know, I thought Corning, and I thought, no, I'm just thinking that because Nasser was head of Corning. All right, so, and what do I think of the Green New Deal proposals? Certainly, from a natural disaster point of view, they need to be looked at very carefully. We want to harness nature's power, not turn it against us. And which is always an exchange. I always tell my students, okay, any new policy, guess what? It's going to create new problems that we get to solve with more policy. It's like policies are like like drugs. They're good for what they're aimed at, but they create side effects that have to be cleaned up. So yeah, I can talk about that at a different time.
Does anyone else have any questions? I mean, if everyone's enjoyed this talk, I'm sure I can get Dr. Nealon to come back later to speak on his upcoming book as well, Declaring Disaster. I knew I'd make you laugh with that one, which will be on the Buffalo Blizzard of 1977 and its roles.
Yes, that one is interesting in terms of how the government can create a new natural disaster category and what that does. Because prior to 1977, guess what? If it snowed, it snowed. You were responsible for digging yourself out. After 1977, we're going to create a new category of disaster so that even if there's a few inches of snow, you can ask for a disaster declaration and you're going to get federal money, which is used by presidents for political reasons and to get electoral votes. And I clearly lay that out in that book. So yeah, if you're interested in how disasters can be manipulated by politicians, absolutely, I'm your guy.
All right. If we don't have any more questions, last call. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Again, thank you to Dr. Timothy Nealon for joining us to speak on his book. It's been a pleasure having you, and have a great day, everyone.